The fire roared like a beast, swallowing the old Victorian house on Maple Street in seconds. Ethan Carter, heart pounding, sprinted toward the blaze, his family's screams piercing the night. He didn't think about the heat or the danger, only about saving them, the people he'd loved his whole life. Ethan, a 28-year-old paramedic with a quick smile and a heart too big for his own good, had always been the one to run toward trouble. Growing up black in a small Oregon town, he'd learned early to fight for his place, to prove his worth in a world that often judged him before he spoke. His broad shoulders carried the weight of expectations, his mother's pride, his father's quiet disapproval, and his younger sister's hero worship. But tonight, as flames licked the sky, none of that mattered. He'd heard his mother's coughs from the second floor, his sister's panicked cries from the back room, and he moved on instinct. The air burned his lungs as he kicked down the front door, splintered wood flying. Smoke stung his eyes, but he pushed through, calling out, "Mama! Lila!" His voice cracked, raw with fear. He found his mother, Grace, slumped against the hallway wall, her face streaked with ash. He hoisted her up, his muscles straining, and carried her through the choking haze to the lawn, where neighbors were already gathering, their faces lit by the orange glow. "Lila's still inside," Grace gasped, clutching his arm. Ethan didn't hesitate. He ran back into the inferno, the heat searing his skin. Lila, his 16-year-old sister, was trapped in her bedroom, the window jammed shut. He broke it with a chair, glass shattering, and pulled her out, her small frame trembling against him. By the time he stumbled out with her, sirens wailed in the distance. The crowd cheered, calling him a hero, but Ethan only felt the weight of his family's survival. The next morning, the house was a smoldering ruin, but Grace and Lila were safe in the hospital, recovering from smoke inhalation. Ethan sat in the waiting room, exhausted but relieved, his hands still smudged with soot. He'd done what he was trained to do, what he was born to do. He expected gratitude, maybe even a rare hug from his stoic father, James. Instead, when James arrived, his face was a mask of stone. "You could have died," James said, his voice low but sharp. Ethan nodded, expecting the lecture to end there. But James's next words cut deeper than the fire ever could. "And for what? To keep living this life you've chosen? You shame us, Ethan. You shame this family." Ethan froze. The hospital's sterile hum faded, replaced by a ringing in his ears. He'd known his father disapproved of his lifestyle ever since Ethan came out at 20, but to hear it now, after he'd risked everything, felt like a betrayal sharper than any flame. "I saved them," Ethan said, voice trembling. "Doesn't that matter?" James turned away, his silence louder than words. Ethan's life hadn't always been this fractured. Growing up in Silverton, a quaint town nestled in Oregon's Willamette Valley, he'd been the golden child, star athlete, volunteer firefighter, the kid who'd help anyone with anything. But when he came out as gay, the whispers started. His church, once a second home, grew cold. His father, a mechanic with a rigid sense of tradition, stopped looking him in the eye. Only his mother and Lila stood by him, though Grace's support was cautious, tempered by her fear of losing James. Ethan found solace in his work as a paramedic, where he could save lives without judgment. And then there was Javier Morales, a 30-year-old graphic designer who'd moved to Silverton from San Diego 2 years ago. Javier, with his warm brown eyes and quiet humor, was everything Ethan hadn't known he needed. They'd met at a local art fair, where Javier's vibrant sketches of the Oregon coast caught Ethan's eye. A conversation about art turned into coffee, then dinners, then stolen kisses by the lake under starlit skies. Javier was the first person who saw Ethan not as a hero or a disgrace, but as a man flawed, hopeful, and fiercely loving. Their relationship wasn't perfect. Javier, who'd grown up in a tight-knit Latino family, carried his own scars from rejection. His parents had called his bisexuality a phase and refused to meet Ethan. But together they built something real, something worth fighting for. They'd talk for hours about their dreams. Javier's hope to open an art studio, Ethan's quiet wish to reconcile with his father. They were planning to move in together when the fire changed everything. The days after the fire were a blur. Ethan stayed with Javier in his small apartment, unable to face the charred remains of his childhood home. The town buzzed with stories of his bravery, but the praise felt hollow. At the hospital, Lila clung to him, her eyes wide with gratitude. But Grace was quieter, caught between her love for Ethan and her loyalty to James. When Ethan tried to talk to her about his father's words, she only said, "Give him time, baby. He's hurting." Time, Ethan thought bitterly, hadn't fixed anything in 8 years. Why would it now? He threw himself into work, taking extra shifts to avoid the silence of his thoughts. But the weight of James's words followed him. One night, after a grueling call where he'd saved a teenager from an overdose, Ethan broke down in Javier's arms. "I ran into a burning house for them," he whispered, his voice raw. "And he thinks this us is the disgrace?" Javier held him, his touch steady. "You're not a disgrace. You're the bravest man I know." But Ethan wasn't so sure. The hero the town saw and the son his father rejected couldn't coexist. He felt like he was splitting apart, and he didn't know how to hold himself together. One evening, as Ethan and Javier walked by the lake, the same one where they'd shared their first kiss, Javier stopped suddenly. "Marry me," he said, his voice soft but certain. Ethan laughed, thinking it was a joke, but Javier's eyes were serious. "I mean it, Ethan. I want a life with you, not just now, but always." Ethan's heart raced, caught between joy and fear. He loved Javier. God, he loved him, but marriage? In a town like Silverton, where half the people still whispered about sinners? Where his own father couldn't accept him? He trailed off, unable to say yes or no. Javier took his hand, his grip firm. "You don't have to answer now. Just know I'm not going anywhere." That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the fire, of his family, of Javier's proposal. He'd spent his life running toward danger to save others. But could he be brave enough to fight for his own happiness? The weeks after the fire stretched into a tense limbo. Ethan and Javier moved into a modest rental house on the edge of Silverton, a temporary fix while Grace and Lila stayed with relatives. The town's admiration for Ethan's heroism hadn't faded. Strangers bought him coffee, clapped him on the back, but it only deepened his sense of isolation. Their praise couldn't erase his father's words, which echoed in his mind like a pulse. "You shame us." Ethan tried to focus on the present. He and Javier painted the rental's walls a soft blue, hung Javier's artwork, and built a life in the small moments. Cooking dinner together, laughing over bad reality TV. But the proposal lingered, an unspoken question between them. Ethan wanted to say yes, to believe they could build a future, but fear held him back. What if his family never came around? What if Silverton never fully accepted them? At the fire station, Ethan's colleagues treated him like a legend, but even there, he felt the cracks. A few older firefighters, men who'd known his father for years, gave him sidelong glances when he mentioned Javier. One, a grizzled veteran named Hank, muttered under his breath about keeping things professional. Ethan ignored it, but the sting lingered. Meanwhile, Lila was thriving. At 16, she was a whirlwind of energy, her dark curls always bouncing as she talked about school, her new theater club, and her dreams of studying marine biology. She adored Javier, who'd taken to teaching her how to sketch. One afternoon, as they sat at the kitchen table, Lila looked up from her drawing of a humpback whale. "You're gonna marry him, right?" she asked Ethan, her eyes bright with hope. Ethan fumbled with his coffee mug. "It's complicated, Lila." She rolled her eyes. "It's only complicated because you let Dad make it that way. Javi's awesome. You're happy with him. What else matters?" He wished it were that simple. Lila didn't see the weight of their father's judgment, the way it pressed against Ethan's chest every time he thought of the future. He changed the subject, but her words stuck with him. Grace, still recovering, was quieter than usual. When Ethan visited her at their aunt's house, she hugged him tightly but avoided talking about the fire or James. One day, as they sat on the porch sipping tea, Ethan couldn't hold back. "Mama, why does he hate who I am so much?" Grace's face softened, but her eyes were sad. "Your father doesn't hate you, Ethan. He's stuck. He grew up in a different time with rules he can't unlearn. But he loves you." "Loves me?" Ethan's voice cracked. "He said I'm a disgrace." Grace reached for his hand. "Give him time. He'll come around." Ethan wanted to believe her, but time felt like a luxury he didn't have. Javier deserved an answer, and Ethan couldn't keep him waiting forever. The turning point came at a town hall meeting. Silverton was planning a fundraiser to help families affected by recent wildfires, including Ethan's. He was invited to speak, a local hero to inspire donations. Standing at the podium, he looked out at the crowd, neighbors, co-workers, strangers. Javier sat in the front row, his smile a quiet anchor. Ethan's speech was simple but raw. He spoke of the fire, of the fear, of the instinct to save his family. "I didn't think about being a hero," he said. "I just thought about the people I love." The room erupted in applause, but as he stepped down, he saw James in the back, arms crossed, his face unreadable. After the event, James approached him. Ethan braced himself, expecting another lecture. Instead, James said, "You did good up there." It was the closest thing to praise Ethan had heard from him in years. But before Ethan could respond, James added, "Just don't think this changes anything." The words hit like a punch. Ethan watched his father walk away, the hope he'd felt flickering out. That night, he told Javier, "I don't know if I can keep fighting for his approval." Javier pulled him close. "Then fight for us. For you." The next day, Ethan took a rare day off and drove to the lake with Javier. The water was calm, reflecting the gray autumn sky. They sat on a blanket, sharing a thermos of coffee, and Ethan felt a spark of courage. "I want to marry you," he said, the words spilling out before he could overthink them. "But I'm scared. Not of you, of everything else." Javier's smile was soft, steady. "We'll face it together." They kissed, the world fading around them, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt whole. But as they drove back to town, a call from Lila shattered the moment. "Ethan, you need to come to the hospital. It's Mama." Grace had suffered a mild heart attack, the doctors said, likely triggered by the stress of the fire and its aftermath. She was stable but weak, her face pale against the hospital sheets. Ethan sat by her bedside, holding her hand, while Lila paced the room, her usual energy replaced by worry. James was there too, silent in the corner, his eyes fixed on Grace. "She'll be okay," the doctor assured them. "But she needs rest and no stress." Ethan nodded, but the weight of his father's presence made the air heavy. He wanted to scream, to demand why James couldn't see the love that drove Ethan to save them all. Instead, he focused on Grace, brushing a strand of gray hair from her face. When Grace woke, she smiled weakly at Ethan. "My boy," she whispered, "always saving us." "Not always," Ethan said, his voice tight. He glanced at James, who looked away. Lila, ever the peacemaker, broke the tension. "Mama, tell Ethan he needs to stop being so stubborn and marry Javi already." Grace chuckled, a sound that eased Ethan's heart, but James's jaw tightened. "Lila," James said sharply. "Not now." "Why not?" Lila shot back, her teenage defiance flaring. "Ethan's happy with Javier. Why can't you just be okay with that?" The room went silent. Grace squeezed Ethan's hand, a silent plea for patience. James stood, his hands clenched. "This isn't the time," he said, and left. Ethan threw himself back into work, but the hospital visit lingered. He and Javier spent evenings planning their future, but the joy was tempered by Grace's health and James's rejection. One night, as they cooked dinner, Javier suggested inviting Grace and Lila to the rental for a family meal. "Maybe if they see us together, it'll help," he said. Ethan was skeptical but agreed. The dinner was warm but tense. Grace, still recovering, beamed at Javier's cooking, praising his empanadas. Lila chattered about school, but James was quiet, his eyes fixed on his plate. When Javier mentioned their engagement, James set his fork down. "You're moving too fast," James said, his voice low. "You don't need to flaunt it." "Flaunt it?" Ethan's voice rose. "I love him, Dad. That's not flaunting. It's my life." Grace reached for Ethan's arm, but he pulled away. "I saved you all from that fire. I'd do it again. But you can't even look at me without seeing something wrong." James stood, his chair scraping the floor. "I'm trying, Ethan. But it's not what I raised you to be." The words hung in the air. Lila's eyes filled with tears, and Grace looked helpless. Javier took Ethan's hand under the table, his touch a lifeline. "You didn't raise me to be a coward," Ethan said quietly. "And I'm not one." James left without another word. The next week, Ethan and Javier attended a local LGBTQ+ support group, a suggestion from a coworker. The stories they heard of rejection, resilience, and chosen families felt like a bomb. One speaker, a trans woman named Marissa, shared how she'd rebuilt her life after her family cut her off. "You don't need their approval to be whole," she said. "You just need to love yourself enough to keep going." Ethan felt a shift. He'd spent years chasing his father's acceptance, but maybe it was time to stop running. He and Javier began planning their wedding, small and simple, at the lake where they'd fallen in love. Lila was thrilled, volunteering to design invitations. Grace, though still weak, promised to be there. But James remained distant. Ethan sent him an invitation, a last olive branch, but got no response. The silence hurt, but Ethan refused to let it define him. He had Javier, Lila, Grace, and a community that saw him for who he was. Maybe that was enough. Spring arrived, painting Silverton in shades of green and gold. Ethan and Javier's wedding was set for June, a quiet ceremony by the lake. Lila had taken charge of decorations, stringing fairy lights through the trees, while Grace, now stronger, helped choose flowers. Ethan felt a cautious hope, but James's absence was a shadow he couldn't shake. At the fire station, Ethan's heroism had earned him a promotion to lead paramedic, a role he took seriously. His team was supportive, but tensions lingered with a few older members. One day, Hank cornered him in the break room. "Heard you're getting married," he said, his tone clipped. "Just don't expect everyone to be okay with it." Ethan's patience snapped. "I don't expect you to throw me a parade, Hank. But I do expect you to respect my life." Hank muttered something and walked away, but the encounter left Ethan shaken. He confided in Javier that night, his voice low. "I thought I was done caring what people think. But it still gets to me." Javier kissed his forehead. "You're human, Ethan. It's okay to feel it. Just don't let it stop you." The wedding planning brought moments of joy. Javier designed their invitations, each one a small piece of art. Lila insisted on a playlist of their favorite songs, from Nina Simone to Bad Bunny. But as the date approached, Ethan's anxiety grew. He kept hoping James would call, would show up, would say something to bridge the gap. But the invitation remained unanswered. One evening, Ethan visited Grace at her new apartment. She was stronger now, her laugh brighter, but she still tread carefully around the topic of James. "He's been going to church more," she said, "talking to Pastor Ellis. I think he's wrestling with things." Ethan's heart sank. Pastor Ellis was known for his conservative views. "Wrestling," he said. "Mama, he's had years to wrestle. I'm done waiting." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I know, baby. I just want my family whole again." "So do I," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "But I can't make him love me." The night before the wedding, Ethan and Javier sat by the lake, the water reflecting the stars. Javier took Ethan's hand, his voice soft. "Tomorrow's about us. Not him, not the town. Just you and me." Ethan nodded, but the ache remained. He thought of the fire, of the moment he'd chosen to run toward danger. He'd been brave then. Could he be brave now without his father's approval? The next morning, the lake was a vision of light and color. Friends from the support group arrived, along with co-workers and neighbors who'd embraced Ethan's truth. Lila, in a bright yellow dress, beamed as she scattered rose petals. Grace, elegant in lavender, walked Ethan down the makeshift aisle, her arms steady in his. As Ethan stood across from Javier, their vows simple but heartfelt, he felt a weight lift. "I promise to run toward you," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter what." Javier's smile was his answer, and their kiss sealed a future they'd fight for together. But as the ceremony ended, Ethan saw a figure at the edge of the crowd. James, in his old suit, stood watching, his face unreadable. Ethan's heart stopped. James's presence was a shock, a crack in the wall of silence. He didn't approach, didn't speak, just stood there as the crowd mingled, music drifting over the lake. Ethan wanted to go to him, to demand answers, but Javier's hand on his arm kept him grounded. "Let him come to you," Javier whispered. The reception was joyful, filled with laughter and dancing. Lila dragged Javier onto the dance floor, her energy infectious. Grace mingled, her smile brighter than Ethan had seen in months. But Ethan's eyes kept drifting to James, who stayed on the sidelines, watching. Finally, as the sun dipped low, James approached. Ethan braced himself, expecting another lecture. Instead, James said, "I didn't come to fight." His voice was rough, like he'd been carrying the words for years. I saw you today. You looked happy." Ethan swallowed hard. "I am." James nodded, his eyes on the ground. "I don't understand it. I don't know if I ever will. But you're my son. And I don't want to lose you." It wasn't acceptance, not fully, but it was a start. Ethan felt tears prick his eyes. "You won't," he said. "But I need you to try, Dad. For me." James didn't answer, but he reached out, his hand resting briefly on Ethan's shoulder. A gesture so small, yet heavier than the fire Ethan had faced. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Ethan with a fragile hope. The months after the wedding were a slow rebuild. Ethan and Javier settled into their life, their home filled with art and laughter. Grace visited often, her health improving, and Lila spent weekends sketching with Javier. James was quieter, but he started calling, asking about Ethan's work, even mentioning Javier once without flinching. At the fire station, Ethan's promotion brought new responsibilities, but also respect. Hank and the others softened, their biases fading in the face of Ethan's competence. The town, too, was changing slowly but noticeably. The support group grew, and Ethan and Javier became mentors, helping others navigate their own journeys. One evening, as Ethan and Javier sat on their porch, watching the stars, Ethan thought of the fire. He'd run into it for his family, but the real courage had come after. Choosing love, choosing himself, even when it hurt. He looked at Javier, his husband, and felt a peace he'd never known. "You were worth it," Ethan said, his voice soft. Javier smiled, leaning into him. "So were you." Their hands intertwined, a promise kept, as the night stretched on. Ethan didn't know if his father would ever fully understand, but he knew one thing. He'd keep running toward love, no matter the flames.